Good evening. Welcome to the meeting of Grand Blanc Township Board for Tuesday, January 23rd. Mr. Mansur, could you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our condolences to Mr. Kent and his family this evening. And with that, we'll call the meeting to order and ask for an approval of consent agenda and the agenda.
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion?
I have a,
Mr. Mansur?
I have a question. So, in the accounts payable, there's a line item that is for a settlement. I guess it's a Tokyo settlement. And I'm just wondering about the background to that. Otherwise, the rest of it looks good to me. Thank you.
Mr. Lemina?
I did send an email out late this afternoon addressing the particulars in that. Because it is litigation, we don't give you full details on it, but it was a 2014 civil rights case versus the Township Police Department. We were granted dismissal of that case in October of 2017. The amount that you saw going through there was litigation claims that include, at that time, 2014, when this event occurred, there was a $25,000 deductible, so we were on the hook up to the first $25,000. So the amount that you saw go through was for legal defense on that case, which, like I said, ended up in being dismissed.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on that?
Nope.
Okay. So there's been a motion and it's been seconded to approve both the consent agenda and the regular agenda. Any other discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, with that, we'll move to citizen comments. And we'll start here on my left. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Please give us your name and address. And
Dennis Keyworth, 1387 Norfolk Avenue in Grand Blanc Township, Concord Green Subdivision. I just looking for an update on the billing based on the road commission, or road repair that took place on Norfolk and Fairview last summer. I know last I knew that they had not yet determined what the final cost was going to be, how it was going to affect the tax costs and interest. So,
okay.
if there's been any.
After we get the rest of the public comment, then I'll ask our superintendent to bring us up to date.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Ert?
Good evening. Ed Ernst, 7212 Border Road. I attended the task force meeting in regards to Parks and Recreation. And I want to ask the board some things here. The agreement between Parks and Recs Commission, between the city, the school board, and the township is over 45 years old. The commission is feeling that it should be reopened and addressed amongst them three entities. So we're asking the board if they would agree with that and give direction or whatever is necessary to get that to happen and implement it. Task Force is also asking that we ask our person on the Park and Recreation Commission to ask for the commission their operating procedures, because we see no way they operate, don't know how they operate. So it'd be nice to be able to see what their perception is how they operate and implement things. So that's the biggest two things, because there are a lot of liabilities here for the three entities. And the structure of this, the Parks and Rec seems to just operate in their own world. Don't know where they're at. So we're asking the board to.
Mr. Supervisor, I don't want to interrupt you, Mr. Ert, but this should probably be done under number 5 of future positioning through our subcommittee reports. I
Are you going to give a
apologize.
report on that?
No, actually, we asked Mr. Ert to do it for our committee.
Okay.
I
Well,
will.
Go ahead, and I would ask you, you might as well continue right now, and
Okay,
If we have to make a motion on some stuff.
okay, well then, I'll come back and do it. I'll come
Sorry,
back.
Mr. Ert.
well, once we are done with public comment, then if there's any motions, then you would need to bring those. Okay, you and Al will?
Pardon?
Okay.
I'll come back and do it.
No, go ahead and finish up what you were gonna say.
Okay, that's basically the two things that the task force is asking for. Direction, okay, for what to do about this agreement and how you're gonna get this thing going. Okay, to meet with the city and the school. And it's just basically to ask them how they feel about this agreement, not to complain about it or anything like that, just let's reopen it, take a look at it, and see if we're operating the way we want to, because when this agreement was written, there was only Bicentennial Park, there was no senior center, there was no Physicians Park. Needs to be addressed, and the task force really doesn't understand what the operating agreement procedures they have to operate under, what they've designed. So if we could get direction for our member on that board, to ask the board, that board for that. Okay?
Thank you, Mr.
Since this is public comment, you do have something under future positionings that I will make a public comment on. If you're talking about beautification in the township, the park, both park entrances could use beautification. They both don't look good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lemata, did you want to comment on our conversation with the road commission with regard to Concord Green?
Absolutely. What I can tell you about the Concord Green project is that the road commission is very well aware that we had some folks here 2 weeks ago at the meeting who had some concerns about their driveway approaches and how that was left. The road commission is well aware. They have documented, they do have pictures of ones that need to be done. The project came in considerably under what we thought our maximum could possibly be. They believe that they have more than enough funding left to address all of those concerns that are leftover punch list items for the spring. But until they do those and complete them, when the asphalt plant gets back open again and construction season is available, they can't give us the final. So unfortunately, what this will do is delay our final. And there were delays in this, and it's recognized that the contractor had several delays that slowed down the project. But even with that, they know that they have the money available to complete the project. It's just that they can't give us a final. We probably won't see it until construction season gets open, so we may not see it till May or June before we actually see the final. We do know that it is anticipated to come in under the amount that we had set aside as the maximum. And we had done ours at $508,000 as a total bond amount that we would have for that project. Even with the retainage they have now, and I think Treasurer Guzak can give you a number, but it's considerably under that amount currently.
Thank you, Mr. Lemata.
I talked to the county, or the committee here about 2 months ago. Maybe pie in the sky, there was some talk that there was some grant money that was sent this way.
No.
I know that was gonna be looked into, that turned out not to be.
No, there was no grant money.
Okay.
Mr.
Yeah.
Chair,
Yes, Mr. Massey.
did we mislead someone? You said you talked to someone. Did we mislead someone as a board?
No, not at all. I was talking to the project manager from Wade Trim, who person I know, and he said that there were 9 projects that I don't know, was state or federal, come to and said, "Have you got any shovel-ready projects?" And they said that was they were given a grant to do it, and that's why they were able to get these all done, outsourcing most of them and get this big chunk of business done. But that was.
The road commission gets grants from time to time for various things, but they also cover all the engineering costs for these projects, so
Oh, yeah.
who knows, maybe they got a grant to cover some of that, but,
I see.
okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Supervisor Bennett? Excuse me. Is there some way that we can, I mean, the residents have been kind of inconvenienced for an extremely long time. I mean, is there some way we can kind of get the repair of this, or they're coming out to the top of the queue? Is there any way we can influence that?
Not during the winter months.
Right, but I mean,
Yeah.
to get them, you know, when the thaw
I'm sure.
breaks, to kind
Yeah.
of, you know, bump them to the top as opposed to starting new projects or whatever. Can we at least inquire if we can do that?
We've had discussion with them, and it is on the priority list.
Okay.
They obviously contract out the work.
Sure.
And they're holding the contractor's feet to the fire with whatever ability they have. But we've talked with them, and they understand that it's unfinished, and it's their priority to get it done, so. All
There
right?
is one other thing in regards to follow-up work on this, I believe. When they did it, they took all the grates, the manholes, whatever they are, and removed them, put a fabric screen type material down, then put the grate down.
Right.
So all the silt and junk doesn't go in and fill up the drain. When they left the project, they didn't remove these screens.
Yeah.
They are full of leaves and frozen like a brick, and we aren't getting drainage. And that's what caused our problem in the first place. I did call the road commission. They sent somebody out to try to remove these grates. They were frozen in. They couldn't do it. I had called them several times previous to this. They ended up just, poking a hole through the screen in the ones in front of my house because I complained, but I'm sure the rest of the neighborhood hasn't been taken care of. So that could be put on the correction list too.
Yeah, if they can do that before the project's done, I don't know, but we can check.
Well, I think once thawed, like
Yeah.
you just had. it's
Yeah,
gonna be
I don't know
a-
what the laws are on when they can remove them, but we'll check into it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Move on to next item under future positioning and our board's subcommittee reports. I think just a couple of things to preface this. Our master plan is going to be make some of these reports or these task force a little bit more urgent than probably what we envisioned, just because we would like some of this information probably incorporated into our master plan. So we'll need to ramp up a few of our meetings to make sure that the issues we cover and the concerns we cover are included in that master plan. But I guess, what we envision these subcommittees as being board committees that a few of us get together and maybe look to our board for some direction in terms of what we would like to see a task force accomplish, and then leaving it to the task force to do some of the legwork on these. From time to time, we'll call in probably some residents to participate in a larger meeting to give us input or direction. But for the most part, they're going to be internal committees that 2 or 3 board members will meet, and either Mr. Limita or any of our staff that we need, or our attorney, to look at issues, whether it's legal issues, whether it's staffing issues, what have you. But the bottom line is that I think our board tonight wants to give some direction to these various issues and maybe highlight some of the things we would like those groups that are going to meet to look into certain aspects that fall under those categories. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Mr. Limita, does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I think you guys are going to ask yourselves as you move through this, like, what do we want to accomplish? And, for the board specifically, these are all items that you guys chose as some of the driving items that you wanted to investigate and work on during your tenure as together as this currently seated board. So I think as you guys get together, ask yourself every time, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our concerns? What are we trying to accomplish? And then really as you go out and you meet in these, you come back and you report to the board, letting them know, like, hey, this is, here's some of our major concerns, here's the progress we made on it, here's additional resource information. The staff here will be happy to provide any resource materials that we need to get for you as you work through this. And then But, you know, we can have people sit in on your meetings if you need somebody there. I mean, that's kind of where we want to go. And then as you guys work through these, again, the master plan is really big, and you guys are going to be really engaged in that over the course of 2018. This is the vision for the future. This is what the next board members who come in and sit in your seats are going to be looking at their master plan for the vision that's been pushed out for, the next 20 years. And, we take advantage of what the folks who sat in the seats before you articulated their vision with public input, and you guys are going to do the same thing. So all of these are critical to get an inclusion in the master plan. So I think that's exactly it. This year will probably be very busy for all of you guys as you work through these and then make sure that they're getting the appropriate representation in our master plan moving forward, that it really articulates the community's vision.
Right. And I think one of the things that I'd like to try and do is, rather than each task force feeling like they have to come to this meeting with a list of motions that they need, voted on, is to make it more of a discussion that we don't pretend to be, or at least I don't pretend to be an expert in any of these areas. And I guess what I want to do is probably look at what questions we have as a board in these different categories. And some of these task force may be simply coming up with even more questions that they try to get answers to, whether it's through staff or other communities that have done similar projects or had similar issues or concerns. And so rather than feeling like you come here with a laundry list of motions or demands or things that here's how we want to do this, make it more of a discussion as to where do we want to go with this, and then as a board make those decisions. So it's probably going to be fact-finding is what these task forces are going to spend a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of. I don't know if that sounds reasonable.
Chairman Bennett, just
Yes.
as I sit on the Planning Commission and kind of get more involved in the process that's being proposed in order to do redo the master plan, one of the areas that the Planning Commission is looking for some guidance, and Giffords-Webster was supposed to kind of get this kicked off, is that they are expecting some, I hesitate to call them visionary, but some input from the board in terms of, what our, well, I'm just going to use vision, what kind of vision we have in the certain areas. And then that helps set some of the boundaries for this. So I agree that we have some fact-finding to do here, but in terms of the appearance of the township, attractiveness, all these things, maybe if we could jot down some maybe aspirational goals that we're trying to achieve here and kind of feed that into the system, then we can start to figure out what gaps we have and in terms of being able to do those and what information we need, et cetera.
Exactly. Yep. So I guess
Do you just want us to jump in?
we have some limited time this evening, but we reserved, this evening to spend majority of our time on these issues. So why don't we start with, I think maybe what we do is, as Mr. Mansur mentioned, we need to develop some vision on these things, and maybe we take them one at a time, and our board responds with what they would see falling under appearance and would like to see some of our task force look into. Mr. Lemata?
Mr. Chair, Trustee Mansour brings up, when you talk about fact finding, so that SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, you guys do that when you get in these committees. But a good visioning to be able to provide from this board to the Planning Commission is you play that, what if I were the king of the world or king of the township and I can do anything I want with parks and recreation or appearance of the township. And sticky notes work just as well for this, and you write it on there and you have everybody kind of do it and put sticky notes up here in your committees. You start to see, like, if money were no object or time were no object, or let's forget about where our problems lie that would prevent us from doing this, and then think about, okay, but can we make that happen in 20 years? Can we make it happen in 10 years? And that will boil it down to that master plan of like, okay, then what do we need to do now to make that happen? So you really should approach these as what do we want to see have happen? Be wide open. Don't think, well, if we had money, we would have bike trails. We would expand our non-motorized trail network. Well, we might have money sometime over the next 10 years or 15 years. it's about getting the vision out there first. So I think if you guys seriously look at, when you're listening to your committee reports talk about this, appearance of the township, or, you know, Parks and Recreation or anything, is, you know, ask yourselves, like, if money were no object, if resources were endless, what would I like to see there? And then you'll be able to flesh that out into whether that's a real reality, if you can approach that thing or not.
Right. One of the things that Mr. Lehman and I spoke about was about a year ago, was it, Mr. Lehman, that we had our board workshop on a Saturday? We had about a year ago that workshop, and I think we both would like to see if we couldn't organize something like that again, and this time focus on doing some of that visioning on each of these categories. I don't know if everyone would be prepared to do that on a Saturday morning. Yes.
Chairman Bennett, so maybe the assignment really, in terms of future positioning in these subcommittees, is to really be able to come back in our next fourth Tuesday meeting with a list of these. Maybe not distilled down, maybe partially brainstorming, partially, you know, whatever, goals or visions for each one of these areas, rather than kind of, you know, going person by person tonight.
Or maybe what we do, I don't know if Mr. Mansour, if we do that homework and be prepared for a Saturday morning.
That's
to go
fine,
through that.
but I guess the point is, it's kind of not
Right.
really tonight.
Try and do it tonight, yeah.
Give us a chance to kind of meet as groups here and really put some thought together.
Right. Is anyone opposed to meeting on a Saturday?
Depends on which
Yes.
one, I think, based on our schedules.
Right, well, yeah, we'd have to make sure,
Right.
but nobody has a standing date on Saturday mornings that they wouldn't be able to do it on any Saturday. Ms. Lane, you had?
I'm looking at the list here, and it just, of who is on which committee.
Yeah, we're gonna have to go over that.
And I don't think that was kind of where we all settled in, or whatever. I think
We'll
we
go
need to
over it and
review
adjust
it
that.
again.
Yeah, we'll adjust that. Mr. Thomas?
Well, I know that today we've met a couple times now on the Parks and Recreation, and there's some things that I'd like to bring up to the board.
Sure, we'll go through them, and we'll go through these and give an update on anything that we
More
know.
of like an operational issues
Yeah.
that I see, and not just grandiose ideas.
Okay.
So,
Grandiose, I like-
Chairman
Yes.
Bennett, do we want to try and get our calendars now, or just want to throw out a couple dates, or how do we want to approach this?
Let's do it by email if that's okay.
Okay?
I could have Megan set up a Survey Monkey poll and
Perfect.
put it out.
Okay, let's do that, and, so, let's see, probably in the next, I would like to see if we couldn't do it before our next fourth Tuesday meeting, if we
Sure.
could. So, before the end of February. Okay, so let's go through these, and if anybody has any updates or questions, the appearance of the township, I guess I'm the only one on that task force, but I think Kathy, you had mentioned that you wanted to be on it.
Yes.
So we'll make sure that you're added to that.
I'd like to be on,
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Terms of update, we haven't had a meeting on that, but one of the issues that I did follow up on was with regard to the I-475 overpass at Hill Road. And I think we removed several tons. Our DPW actually went out and took care of it. It's actually a road commission responsibility, but our DPW went out there with the assistance of the road commission and removed about 2 to 4 tons worth of rubble from that overpass and the median, probably towards late fall, and it just looked 1,000% better. So those are the kinds of things we need to identify and figure out a way to get them done. Yes, Ms. Lane?
The other thing we've talked about several times is we have major intersections that come into the township. On Maple Road, you're talking about Fenton Road, Saginaw, Dort Highway, and Center. And if there were to be any developments at any of those corners, we suggested having something like the walls that Rite Aid and McDonald's put up at Fenton and Hill Road as being at those corners. And one of the
proposed developments you were talking about was at the MTA and Dort Highway.
Yes.
And so, at least starting with the north end, and then, of course, with Tech Village, I'm sure Security Bank and some of them will be working on enhancing that entrance as well.
Yes. Okay.
On that
Yes.
walls, is this a planning commission type of zoning ordinance that we decided years back that we're gonna put these walls up?
Now, those were site plans when Rite Aid and McDonald went in. We were talking about those and they went ahead on their own. And Rite Aid was the first one, and then when McDonald's did their renovation, they sort of matched it. Not they're similar enough. Rite Aid put in a little bit more landscaping.
Obviously, we'll have to have the input of the planning commission on those, because when somebody comes to us with a project, you know, for example, MTA on that corner, we're gonna have to have the involvement of the site plan, what have you, but certainly we can think those things through and present them, especially if somebody's has a project coming up. It's an opportune
Right.
time to bring that issue up.
So we'd be just talking about, I mean, what we're doing is talking about setting an aspirational goal, a vision for kind of how
Right.
we expect the entrances to the major entrances township to look. That's
Right.
fine.
Mhm.
That can be codified in a general, but still, you know, create expectations.
While we're looking at it, you know, about the Young Man Sort roundabout, I'd like to make sure, I mean, if we are gonna do roundabouts, that we can put something in the middle.
Well, I've had discussion, you know, we've had discussion with the road commission, and they're looking into it. I've sent them, they've received a couple of examples, and so hopefully we'll be hearing something back on that.
And the residents thought that was a good idea too when I saw them
Yeah.
around town, so.
Yeah, good. Moving down to business attractiveness, restaurants and retail. I know that a couple of months ago, we did meet Mr. Massey, Mr. Mansour, myself, and I know Mr. Limita is working on one of our aspirations is to have a spreadsheet that kind of compares, I don't know, various communities in terms of their water. The challenge right now is that we're kind of comparing apples and watermelons in terms of how people lay out those costs. And so we're trying to get a handle on that, or our consultant is.
Yep, we've instructed Dan Potter for Potter Consulting to put this together for us. He has been working on it. It is one of the challenges. I mean, we all know that enterprise funds are going to pay for those no matter what the municipality is. And the cost to put in a length of pipe in the ground in Grand Blanc Township isn't any different than the cost to put in that same length of pipe in a neighboring community. So it's just the way that they decide to set up their capital fee recapture back into their enterprise funds. And some people do it more heavily through rates. Some people do it more with straight up front capital costs. So it's not as easy as saying how much would it cost to put in a 150-seat restaurant in your community. Not everybody compares it the same way. There's a lot of ways to do it. I personally prefer the capital fees versus putting it in rates, because the rates end up spreading out all over, and the large type manufacturing facilities or big box outlets that don't really use a lot of water or sewer, but you've got to design a system to meet fire flow needs to get to them, has a much bigger incredible cost to get to them than to a residential housing development, for example. Then you put it all in rates, and then it's on the folks, the residents, who are going to pay for all those capital costs, and of course larger manufacturing and that don't use a lot of water are all for it. So there's a real balance in there, but it's every community does it somewhat different. Nobody follows the exact same model in how they set it. So there's a challenge, but eventually we'll get it. We have the one from 2 years ago that we did just straight up comparisons on capital fees and rates, but some of that can be misleading. We've got to make sure that we're capturing all the enterprise costs that exist.
Okay. Yes, Ms. Lane?
Mr. Supervisor, for business attractiveness, restaurants and retails, I always sort of refer to the villages of Rochester and their signage, because I think signage either can be a positive or a negative, and the Planning Commission is right now looking at the sign ordinance, and we have to use them a little bit more wisely than I think, and renovate some of the old ones, or decide to see if we can get them removed and changed.
Well, make sure you include that on your list that we're going to forward. With regard to DPW, water, sewer, drains, I know one of the things that we'll need to talk about, and we still have room for one more board member on there, it looks like, we got Kent and myself, Clark Kent and myself, is the capital improvement plan, you know, our future plans and vision for the master plan. We have, I think, some philosophical things that we want to discuss in the very near future, and that's whether or not we want to, when somebody's going through a major street rebuilding in their subdivision, whether or not we want to include water in that while we're doing that work. And then also taking a look at, you know, where future development will occur and making sure that we have adequate resources, you know, in those areas as well, as far as water and sewer. Anything else on DPW, sewer, water?
There is an area that you can explore in your committee as well, and we talked about it earlier today, but just that concept too of the, when you look at cost of service studies and the cost of providing fire protection to a community, part of that cost is incorporated in making sure you have water capability there. And if I'm a resident who lives in a subdivision that I don't have water in my subdivision, yet I'm a water customer in a subdivision, I'm paying a little bit more if I have residential water for fire protection, because I'm making sure there's adequate water supply, there's hydrants, there's things where they can go and get water. So that it's worth for the subcommittee to at least take a look at those and talk about the true cost of providing fire protection, making sure we're spreading that fairly amongst all of our residents.
And that leads into our next task force, which would be fire protection. And,
Yes, when we meet, we need talk about a 5-year plan for fire protection, and that would include, do we have the fire hydrant that we need in certain subdivision? Are they spaced properly in proximity of each other? So, but also, I feel as though that anything that we discussed in the task force meeting, we have to correlate that with the fire commission to make sure that our plans coincide with the fire commission.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think as Mr. Limita and, you know, had pointed out, this is kind of what our task force is going to try and do maybe in our Saturday morning meeting, is set out kind of the vision, and then once we formulate what we see as our township vision, you taking it to the commission and saying, hey, here's what we envision. Is this, you know, do we have the same vision as the city or whoever the partner is in, you know, that particular commission? In this case, the fire would be the city.
But thinking aloud here, I'm not saying every meeting, but once we get down to the nitty-gritty in some of the meetings,
Right.
I think we need to include the fire chief before we spend too much
Yes.
time on something
Oh,
that
absolutely.
may
Yeah.
not move forward.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of these task force, if we're talking about DPW, water, sewer, and drains, I think Mr. Sears is going to be there, and maybe even Dan Potter, depending on, you know, what we're getting into. But yes, absolutely, we're going to have the professionals when we're talking about some of these topics in the room. Mr. Limita?
Scott, before you guys move off of DPW, water and sewer too, I also would think that a real good topic of conversation for that subcommittee is we have kicked around a little bit about when somebody's willing to completely redo their roads, that,
You were consulting, I brought that up, but we're
you
good.
know,
Yeah.
Okay, I just think
Yeah.
that it's a great topic, that really, those are the kind of things that, what was talking about, master planning, visioning for the future, where we're gonna be.
Future development and where that's going to be located, and if we have the resources in those areas that we need.
Exactly.
So fire, I don't know if there's anything on the task force, I don't know that's met recently, but obviously everything's moving forward in that area. Yes,
Yes.
Mr. Limita?
I have one other point while you're on the fire protection task force too, is if you know, we did include the meeting minutes now on the consent agenda. If you read back to the fire commission minutes from December 19th that were included in the packet, one note is Jamie Weasel, the city's representative on the Fire Commission, did discuss that they've instructed their attorney to begin to look into the dissolution process of the Fire Commission. And I think that knowing that they have done that, and I don't know it means that they're moving in that area, but they have instructed their attorney. So I went back and read the city commission's December minutes, and they did instruct their council to start looking into the dissolution process. You guys, as a board, may want to have your attorney looking in the same direction, if that is indeed the direction that the city chooses to go in. We'd rather not wait and then start the process. If they're already having their attorney work on it, you guys may want to instruct Mr. Laddie to do the same.
I thought we did, I'm sorry.
Mr. Thomas?
I thought we instructed Attorney Laddie to do that in our November board meeting.
You did, but well, that was one of our discussion points that when Dennis and I met with Mr. Griffin and the city representative, that we included in the potential attention, I guess, in our joint ordinance. I don't think that though we got back to this board with any sort of layout or flow chart or an idea of what that would look like. And frankly, we didn't discuss it with Attorney Griffin either, but it seems as though the city, or at least a member of the Fire Commission and the City Council, are interested in that process as well. So I'm happy to do that if that's what you decide you
Do
want
we
to have
need a
done.
consent agreement? I thought it was already being done and looked at and just waiting for the results. But if we need a consent agreement from the board to do it, then I say we
Yeah. I think what Mr. Laddie was looking into was putting it in the new document that was going to be
Right.
drafted, not necessarily
Oh.
to draft. Yeah.
But I mean, you can have both, right? Because that process is,
I wanted in, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
in a form of a consent agreement with the board, I think that I would, well, I personally would like to see it black and white and have it done, ready to sign, to dissolve the fire
Okay.
commission.
Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair, at this time, I don't think we should be discussing that. I think we should hold off and see what the city has to say. Because frankly speaking, our move will escalate something else, and I don't think we want to go down that road at this time. That's just my personal thinking, and I'll just leave it as that.
Okay. Mr. Laddie?
I am, my impression of the Fire Commission discussion or the notation, and Mr. Lehman will have to correct me if the city council's was different, is just to explore what the process looks like, not to engage
what I'm
in that
asking, too.
process.
Right.
Does
But I'd
that-
like
does that-
it done this.
Does that change your mind? And that's really in response to, I think, the council saying, let's have a look at what that looks like.
That doesn't change my mind. Just to think about it, it frightens me.
I understand. I
So,
understand.
so I'm trying not to move in that direction until we get more information back from the city.
Well, yeah, and that wouldn't, and by the way, I mean, I wouldn't consider it a move in that direction. And maybe if the process was made clear to both the city council and the township board, you would
Decide
you
not
would
to.
be less hesitant to move in that direction, because it's not an easy process. But I'll leave it to you I'll take whatever direction you give me.
Chairman Bennett,
Yeah, Mr.
just a thought here. So ultimately, I suspect, based on what we've heard here, that the city is going to come back with some kind of information. And it certainly, I think, it would not be any more provocative than what the city is already engaged in for us to be ready to have our interpretation or our view of what that would mean as well. So when each of us would have kind of notes that we could compare at a meeting. So again, I don't know that doing something on our end is more provocative than has already been established.
Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I disagree with my colleagues. I think we should wait until we get more information from the city, because I do not want us to have the appearance that we are rushing to judgment. And I believe, based on the information that I have at my fingertips, that would be probably a way to commit suicide. So if the city choose to go down that road, let the city make the first move, okay?
Well, they just did, Joe. I'm sorry.
Well, they haven't, the city has not come back with any information yet. Wait until the city comes back with information. Now, when we decide to move and it becomes a political fight, it's gonna be a very nasty fight. It's not gonna be a nice fight like you may think it's gonna go. It's gonna be very nasty because I think it was raised, the issue was raised a couple of months ago, okay? What would happen if we didn't have the city? And I remember some of those discussions. And what would happen if the millage didn't pass? I remember some of those discussions. So I'm saying if you do not remember those discussions, you should refresh your memory because it's going to be a nasty political fight.
Ms. Lane?
I understand, Joe, where you're coming from, but I would think, I agree with my colleagues, but let me try and put it a different way. If you're planning or you're thinking of something in the future, and you have an opportunity to study it, and somebody else studies it, and then you have a better discussion because you both understand it, rather than coming to a game and not even knowing the rules of the game, makes it more difficult for you to get caught up and make proper decisions. So preparation and knowledge is always worthwhile. It's the actions and how you handle it that make it nasty, but having information doesn't make it nasty.
I think one of the things that we've said from the outset is we're stronger together, you know, with our fire, with any of these joint activities. And I understand where you're coming from, the perspective you have, Joe. You put a lot of time in at the Fire Commission and work hard to try and make things work, you know, as a joint operation. But I think, you know, what we're looking at here is just wanting to make sure that we're prepared, not that we're trying to provoke anybody or to lay any groundwork or anything else other than just being prepared. That we know, and it may dissuade and may encourage greater cooperation if we know how difficult the breakup might be. I mean, people don't realize sometimes, you know, when you separate, whether it's family issues or business issues or government issues, how difficult the separation can be. And I think it may cause our partnership to be stronger if we know what people will be dragged through or what our boards will be dragged through. So I think being prepared, it isn't meant to be provocative or provoke anybody to make a change, but if they're wanting to know the rules, I really don't know what would be involved on our behalf, but I'd be curious to know. Just Mr. Laddie?
No, and you're right. There isn't a specific path for this. It would probably be a combination. We'd have to look back historically at what documents exist regarding dissolution language, and some of them, and I have seen that. There are parallel circumstances, like an Act 57 Fire Authority has a process for that. This won't be an exact science. It won't be a flow chart. It'll be an idea of what it may look like, and I think you raise a good point. It won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. And so if you want to try to get your, I guess again in response to your partner saying, hey, maybe we should look into this. If you decide to do that, I'm happy to lay out what I think the process would likely look like.
Mr. Laddie, if we told you to go ahead with it, how long of a time period would it take to research that? I mean, is there any urgency to doing this?
No, I would think that over the course, I mean, I'm guessing if we're not in any big hurry, I could probably have that, a fairly thorough report done in a week or 10 days.
Oh, okay.
If you need more, if you want it spread out over a longer time, though, I mean, the
Right.
timing's up to you.
Okay.
If you want, the other thing you can do is you can say, well, why don't you look into it and begin formulating a report, but hold off on releasing it to see what comes out of the city's side.
Okay.
I mean, it's all up to you.
Right. Mr. Massey?
I just want to echo what the attorney said, one of the things he said. It's not going to be cheap. So just want you to hear that. It's not going to be cheap.
To separate the two.
Yes.
Right.
It sounds easy to say yes, but it may be a pill you may not want to swallow when it comes time to swallow it.
So it sounds like,
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I would like to make an official motion that we,
Well, let me see if we can come to a consensus.
I
here.
want to make it an official motion because I thought we did come to a consensus last
Well,
time.
Let's just see if we all agree that, it sounds like we need to know what the rules are. I think you would agree to that too, Mr. Massey, that.
Yes, we need to know what the rules are.
On separating the two. It
Yes,
sounds like we don't want it to be provocative and that we're sticking a needle in things to pop the balloon.
absolutely.
So I think we can all agree that we need Mr. Laddie to look into what the terms of dissolution would look like, or at least from our perspective, what we think they should look like. How soon we need it, I don't know. I mean, our agreement with the city continued, our millage continues for some time, and we're gonna have a vote next year, or later this year, rather.
It does, and it isn't, I mean, you currently have, again, your next scheduled event really is to pass the resolution for your own millage. And then, I think we wanted to see what the result of that was, and then reach back out to the city to find out how we would arrive at a joint, changes to the joint ordinance. So you're not really on an urgent timeline as far as any of this goes. I guess it's possible, I mean, just hypothetically, and God forbid this happens, but I mean, you could get a notification from the city at some point in the future that says that they're interested in exploring a dissolution, but until that event happens, I think you have time to weigh your options and just see what it looks like.
What would be the timeframe that we'd like to have something like this? By the end of next month?
No,
Yes.
No?
no.
Yeah.
I would say April. I'd say April.
I'm not,
Well,
we're talking about, the city said, they're looking to it. They're gonna have their ducks in a row. I'm not worried about, I've said it all along, we're stronger together, but at this point, let's keep in the back of my mind that they're paying $222,000 a year. And we can handle running our own fire department. Everybody on this board, we've discussed it, we know that. So if they want to run their own fire department and have their own fire authority, or however they want to do it, it's $222,000 a year to take care of our residents. So
May I?
well, it'd be an additional 200.
it'll be an additional
We pay,
$222,000.
what, 1.8?
Give or take, because you're losing 10,000 people. But anyways, my point is, they've got their ducks in a row. I'd like to get our ducks in a row. By the end of next month, I will agree with the consent agreement and not make a motion. But the end of next month.
But Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I have a thought. I would rather for the task force to meet
Or?
before we make a decision. And then once we meet and have a discussion, then we can come back with a much clearer decision.
Joe, I'm sorry, excuse me,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
So you would like to have a task force meeting prior to us
Yes.
making that decision?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
I'm on the task force. Do you see a need to meet Mr. Gruzak? You're on the task force.
No, I think if the board overall wants to look at it, I think all we're doing is, they're looking at a situation and saying, well, how's this gonna work? So why can't we look at the same situation and say, well, this is how it's gonna work? All we're doing is looking at the same procedure they are. We're not jeopardizing anything.
Mr. Mansour?
Chairman Bennett,
Yeah.
so I guess the question is, did I hear right that my colleague wants the task force to meet, or talking about a meeting of the fire commission?
The task force.
Okay.
Yes, the task force to meet.
Well, we're kind of, I'm hearing that we all want to have Mr. Laddie look into this. It's a matter of, I guess, in terms of how quickly we want the information back. Ms. Lane?
Initially, there were 3, and then you had Mr. Thomas join our group. But I see no problem if it's reasonable for Mr. Laddie's timeframe to get it done by February to get it done, and to meet to say, have the same discussion we're having now, and have 3 of us say, well, let's come back to this board. It's a delay. Let's, just move forward.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
we're not gonna have the same discussion that we are having now. That will be additional information, and you will have enough information to make a sound decision. If you're shooting from the hip, it's gonna come back to haunt you.
What additional information, Trustee Massey?
Well, if I told you now, there would be no need to have a task force meeting.
Well,
I mean,
Well, there's 4 of us.
I mean,
Oh,
I
God.
sure can you try to be?
One of the things that,
Mr. Bennett, or
what-
Chairman Bennett, I wouldn't have a problem if we met as a task force, and I can't believe I'm saying this, because it's all gonna be regurgitated information. But Joe's promising me a surprise, so as long as we meet by no later than the end of next week, and then bring it back to the board,
first meeting.
First meeting.
first meeting, and then direct,
Okay.
at that time,
Let's do that then.
Attorney Laddie, at that time, would that give us 10 days?
If we decide, Mr. Thomas is asking that if our task force meets before the end of next week, and then
Yeah.
we bring it to our board first meeting of February, that you would be able to have something maybe,
Leave me alone.
something fairly soon after that.
Yeah, that would be fine. And by the way, I just want to be clear. The directive to Mr. Griffin, according to these minutes of the Fire Commission, were to look into and report his findings to the City Council regarding the process. And it doesn't say process, but I'm reading into it the process of dissolution of the Fire Commission. Not triggering the process, not a detailed analysis of what equipment goes where and who paid for what, just an outline of the process, an expectation of time, things like that, right?
Attorney Laddie, did you say that was from the Fire Commission, or you said Fire Commission?
City Commission.
City Council,
Well, Mr. Weasel made reference to it in the minutes of the Fire Commission meeting. He said, quote, "Lastly, the council discussed dissolving the Fire Commission, period. They have given a directive to Mr. Griffin to look into it and report his findings to the City Council."
So they're discussing whether or not to dissolve it, and they want him to look into the process. So I think we've got some consensus here, that we're going to
Can Chief Burdett answer?
We're going to have a task force meeting before the end of next week,
Yes.
and then we are going to have it on the agenda for the first meeting of next month and move
Yes.
forward. In the meantime, I'm sure Mr. Laddie can do some research on his own as well, but Chief Burdett, did you have some input?
No, the input to that is to find out what the process is.
Okay,
They decide to go ahead and just.
okay. Well, so we're gonna have a task force meeting before the end of next week?
Yes.
Okay. Before everybody leaves, then let's set that up.
Yes.
What's that, Mr. Guzan?
I don't understand, I'm just confused. They wanna look at a process, so they could come back in less than 2 weeks and say, here's the process, here's what we wanna do, and we won't have any idea of what the procedures are. So to me, I don't think we need a task force. I think we should just
Well,
have Mr. look at it and have it by the end of the month, Because they could drop this thing on us at any time, and we won't know anything, so we're not prepared whatsoever.
Well, the only thing is that, Mr. Laddie, correct me if I'm wrong, but even if our partner came to us and said, hey, this is the process we want to dissolve, it's not going to happen overnight.
Correct.
It's going to be a year-long process, probably.
I think yes, I think you're talking about a year-long, and beginning the process will be a series of discussions, a series of notifications. I envision some sort of probably oversight mediation from a court, things like that. So this is not something that anybody can trigger overnight. But we might as well get, I guess, again, if both sides of the partnership, or if one side of the partnership is saying, hey, tell me what the process is, it wouldn't do you harm to know what the process is yourself.
And I think, one of the things that me personally, I see is that if we have a board member who serves on a commission or what have you, I want to, if it's Mr. Thomas that's coming to us regarding the parks and he wants us to hold off because he wants to have a task force, I want to honor that as well. And Mr. Massey's put in quite a bit of time, personal time as a trustee meeting with the fire commission, and if he would like to meet with the task force to get their input or to give some input, I'd like to give some deference to that as well. So if we could have the task force meet before the end of next week, and then we will have it on the agenda, and I'm sure Mr. Laddie's probably going to be doing some research on his own. I think we'll have an answer to that process question probably sometime beginning of February. Okay? So we have a consensus. Anybody disagree with that? Okay, Mr. Laddie understood what
I do.
direction we want to go. Okay.
Better be good information, Joe.
Believe
Okay.
me, it will.
Okay, Parks and Recreation.
Better make my socks go up and down. The Parks and Recreation met today, and the representatives of the task force is Ed Ert, Earl Guzak, myself, and Al Mansour. And Ed, do you want to go over our report?
Well,
He did
Or-
yeah,
I'm sorry, Art.
I would like you and Al, we want to keep it
Al.
up here for right now. But
Can I?
Al? Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. So, this is kind of my introductory session into this task force. And one of the things, the first thing to take a look at is the existing agreement that established the Parks and Recreation Commission. The agreement started in 1970. Last time it was signed off in 77, which I think is 40 years ago. And so, in kind of looking through that, one of the things that strikes me is that there haven't been any amendments to it since then. So we have a 40-year-old plus agreement that we're looking at. So that kind of immediately brings to consideration the thing that we ought to at least initiate a discussion with our partners in the commission about a review of the agreement. The other thing that being a new person to the task force is that I was looking for was what type of procedures that the commission operates to that basically operationalizes that agreement. And that wasn't available to me. So I don't know if it requires how we want to communicate that, but I would certainly be in favor of this board asking the Parks and Rec Commission to take a look at reviewing the agreement, and especially providing basically their operating procedures to us that again marry up with that agreement and tell us basically how they're operating.
Mr. Mansur, do you know if such a document exists as far as an operating?
I am not
procedure?
aware that it is, and for me to have a commission that, by all accounts here is $1 million plus commission operating without kind of a written procedures seems to be a weakness that we ought to take a look at.
And I think I like the approach of asking them for that direction. So.
That would
Ms.
be
Lane?
something, Mr. Bennett, that we would ask Mr. Thomas to take back to them at the next meeting, isn't it?
On behalf, I guess that's.
On
I don't know
behalf
if-
of our board is what
Exactly.
we're asking Mr.
Yes.
Thomas then to do.
Correct.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm being directed by the trustees to
Yeah, I think, one of the
bring
things,
back the procedural manual, if there is one. And then at the same time, we're asking that our three partners, township, city, and the school board, to
Review the existing
agreement.
commission agreement, yes.
I think one of the things, that Ms. Edson, our director of the park, she attended the last task force, if I recall. And I think she'd be amenable to attending any of the future meetings as well.
Fine.
And I think, our meeting that we're going to have, our board retreat or our Saturday workshop, I think will be very helpful too, because I think one of the things that we want to look at is, what do we want our township parks to look like, and then passing that along. We have a master plan. I'm not sure how well everybody's, reviewed that, but, for the parks and rec, but I think we are going to add to that. We, Mr. Limita and I, have met with the road commission, because there's a few projects that we're working in concert with in terms of non-motorized pathways. So for example, the Dort Highway extension, they would like to have, if we're going to put a pathway along that extension, it's best that we do it when the road's under construction rather than trying to do it later. And so one of the things that we need to have incorporated into that master plan for the parks is a little bit more extensive outlining of those non-motorized pathways. So
Chairman Bennett,
Yes.
I agree with that. In the existing master plan, there's guidelines that say when we're going to be doing new roads that we consider non-motorized pathways. And in terms of the overall amenities for the township, considering Tech Village and all the rest of these things, I mean, a nice park system would certainly be an attractive thing to encourage businesses and people to continue to reside here and add residents.
I think it ties into the appearance and what have you.
Everything.
Yes, Ms. Lane?
For clarification to Mr. Thomas, it's my feeling that we're asking the members of the Parks and Rec Commission who are representatives for the city, schools, and ourselves to look at their agreement, not to have a joint meeting with the school board, the city council, and us to look at that agreement.
Correct.
So you're just going to have the Parks and Rec Commission as their representatives evaluate that agreement. Is that correct, Mr. Thomas?
At this time, I think we want
Yeah,
them
at
to.
this time.
This time.
But I think there may come a time where we do need to meet with the principals
Right.
of all three organizations, whether it's the mayor, myself, Mr.
School board
Limita,
chair,
as well
whoever.
as the school superintendent. But at this point, I'd like to have the input of the Parks Commission to get their direction, since they're operationally the involved party. I mean, it would be similar to if we wanted an operating, what do we call the document, an operating agreement? Or if we wanted something like that, operating procedures for the
Procedures, yeah.
township, we would go to Mr. Limita and his department heads.
Right, exactly.
So that's what we're doing with the Parks and Rec.
Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Massey?
I'm interpreting this as that when they review the current agreement, what they will have in mind is how it can improve.
Or if they're
Hopefully.
happy with it.
Huh?
Or if they're happy, I'm sorry.
Or if Mr. Thomas?
Mr. Massey, what we're asking is for this agreement that has had no amendments, but there's been amendments made.
there's been-
Numerous amendments made to this agreement, but nothing in writing. This agreement to be looked at.
My colleague, do you mind repeating what you just said?
This
I wouldn't call them amendments.
This agreement that's been signed by the three principals 41 years ago, has,
Not been followed.
okay,
There hasn't been amendments to it.
it has not been followed, and there's no procedural chain. And so what we're asking as a task force is to have the principals look at this agreement and at the same time put down in writing all the procedural changes that have happened over the course of the years, so we can redefine the agreement, or if they're happy with the agreement, leave it as it is.
Let me just back up, 'cause
But let
you
me
said
say something,
principles.
Mr. Chair.
We want to have the director and the board do that, but,
That's
yes,
it.
Mr. Massey.
But I don't quite understand what you're saying. If trustee Mansour said the agreement really hasn't, it's a 41-year-old agreement, so it can't be current. So based on what you're saying, you're trying to make a 41-year-old agreement sound as though it may not need any changes, and that's hard for me to believe.
Oh, I totally agree with you.
Oh, okay.
I totally agree with you. I'm just
Okay.
putting, I'm just saying that the three principals might come back, meaning the city, township, and the school board might come back and say, hey, it's been working great the last 41 years, and we don't see a reason to change this agreement.
Well, let me
which
tell you something right now, trustee. Please do not bring that back to the board.
bring-
Do not
That's
bring
right.
a comment like that back to the board. Then that will tell me that the the principals or superintendent are not doing their job.
I would never put that in anyone's mind.
Okay.
I think it's good that we're letting the Parks Commission
Exactly right.
decide whether or not they think that's a very good working agreement, but,
And
so I
then
think,
looking-
so Mr. Thomas, you'll take that from them. I think, is that a consensus
bated
amongst
breath.
our board that we
Yes.
would like
Yes.
him to ask them to research that?
With bated breath.
Okay, so you have a consensus that we would like them to review that themselves.
That's how we came up with it.
Okay, moving on to the Perry Homestead.
Well,
Mr.
the
Thomas,
Perry
did you wanna
Homestead-
talk about that?
Excuse me, that task force, again, is made up with myself, Earl Guzak, Supervisor Bennett, and Ed Ert, resident Ed Ert. And we met today, and we need to get some direction from the board. The number one thing that we have to look at is, what is the purpose of the Perry property? What is the purpose? Now, as a four-person task force, if you would like, as a consent agreement for the four of us to come back to you, what our ideas of the purpose of the Perry Homestead should be, I'm sorry, the Perry property, or if I'm asking everyone in this right now, if you have any ideas what the Perry Homestead, Perry property should be.
I think, going along with what Mr. Mansur suggested in terms of us, wondering what I'm going to say, aren't you? What he suggested in terms of people sending in, and we'll have a format for individuals to do that. But, for example, we're going to ask for board member suggestions for the task force to look into the appearance of the township, to look at, business attractiveness, that we do the same thing for the Perry Homestead, that what is our board, and maybe we can put a few questions on that form. So we ask because I think it's very difficult for us to, as a task force, tackle the Perry Homestead when we really aren't sure what the questions are that we're looking for, the answers. So what is the purpose, I think, is going to be the main question. So maybe rather than us trying to answer that question tonight, we put that on that form, what our board members and Mr. Limita feel that,
Or do you want the task force, which, like we
it's an option
discussed in
too,
our task
having the
force.
task force come up with that. I would feel more comfortable having the entire board give that input, but Ms. Lane?
If you were to, like with all of the other meeting minutes that are mentioned here, if you were to go to the township's website and look up the Historic Commission minutes, it would inform you as to what that group is doing and what their aims are. And that particular group was started when the Perry House was purchased. So they've been working for years. We might want to find out what their long-term, short-term or long-term direction is, and then compare it with what you as, or we as individuals want to do, rather than all of a sudden, with a year under your belt, saying this is what we're going to do when a commission has been formed and has been operating for more than 8 years.
I think we'll do that, but I think what we want to do is, as a board, find out what our board members see as the purpose, because we have the liability and the fiduciary responsibility The commission obviously has been putting a lot of time over the years, and they have a vision for that. And certainly before any decisions were made, we would see whether or not the vision that the board has for it meshes with, and also include their input as well. But I think right now what we're looking at, and that's where, you know, I want to make sure we're going to ask for resident input, you know, on any of these items. And as far as the task force membership, it's going to be board members. We are going to get, you know, the input of Mr. Ert and others, as well as the Historic Commission. But we're talking right now just getting input from our
What the board
members.
wants to do
Right.
with the property.
Exactly.
You know, what the board, what some committees, not commissions, but committees want to spend on, you know, that goes back to Superintendent Lima's idea, taking the yellow stickets and say, if I had all the money in the world, you know, if I want to form a committee, but it's our responsibility. And I think that we should stop, and so the task force brought this up, and I think that we should stop all activity at the Perry House, until Perry property homestead, until we get a feel for what our board's purpose is for this.
You know, I kind of look at it, I had a conversation going on Facebook with some residents with regard to snow plowing. And I had a resident say, why are we paying for snow plowing? If you're telling me, Scott, that the roads are the county's responsibility, then let's sell the plowers and get out of the business. And I tried to explain to them that, well, you know, many years ago, after a snow event, we plowed the roads, and ever since then, it's been very difficult. And I think the Perry home, you know, if you look, I don't know if the board has ever put in writing what they see the purpose of that being, but I think we have lots of different ideas on what the purpose is supposed to be, whether it's supposed to be a historic preservation site, whether it's supposed to be a wedding chapel and reception place, or reenactment center. I mean, we need to, before we spend any more money, I agree that we need to look at the purpose, and if we agree that it's supposed to be rented for weddings, then let's go down that route. If it's meant to be a reenactment center and everybody agrees, then let's go full force that way. But I think, you know, just like the plowing, before we just start doing something, we need to make sure it's in our wheelhouse, that we become experts at that. I don't really think the township should be in business to compete with other businesses, so I'd shy away from those activities that we already have facilities for that are for profits. But if it's something for the good of our community that we don't have, then, and we're not competing with private business, then great. Ms. Lane?
Mr. Thomas, I know one of the things you did was, I think you've had discussion with our building inspector about the barn out there, because that, to me, is a real liability and safety issue.
I've talked to the building inspector, but Supervisor Bennett, who is a member of the task force, he kind of got some answers for us on the barn tonight.
Well, Mr. Limda has a full report, so I don't know, Mr. Limda, you might want to touch on a few of those things.
We did have Mr. Shapansky, the building official, do a walkthrough a few years ago. I had a written report. I do have that document available. Handed out to the board before, but it must have been prior to this seated board. It must have been the previous board. So we'll make sure to get you guys copies of that out. I can probably scan it in and send it out to you. It's not that we're concerned that the barn is in imminent danger of falling down. I mean, it's a beautiful constructed mortise and tenon, you know, but you see where it has shifted, time has shifted it. So it's not something we would want people in. We would never side of there. You know, but it is important that you guys make a decision about, do we want to keep that barn? Is it going to be restored, or is that something that we should be doing RFPs for, to get somebody to come and salvage the barn wood and get it out of there for us? I think it would be quite costly if we had to tear it down ourselves. Hopefully we'd be able to find somebody who'd be willing to.
They're having trouble hearing you in the back of the room. They're motioning to me.
So if they, I think the board really does have to make that determination on how you want to proceed with it. I mean, again, I don't think it's going to fall on anybody, but it absolutely isn't prepared for public use. Maybe it'd be better use as a parking lot in that area versus thinking that we would ever, I mean, I can't imagine what it would cost to restore that barn, but I would think that it would probably be in the high tens of thousands of dollars.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Massey.
I recall probably last summer, we had a discussion about the bond. And I think we all agreed that the bond should be raised, should be torn down. And I was thinking that that should be the first thing that we do, because the bond is a hazard. If you try to have wedding reception and you have the bond, you may be asking for a liability responsibility.
Well, that's where, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mr.
That's
Thomas.
where it comes back to, we have to find a we have this facility, and as a board, we have to figure out what the purpose is. When you read the historical committee's reports and their minutes of their meetings, they're always talking about renting out the facility for wedding showers, barn weddings, excavating, reenactments, and it's from here to here, Trustee Massey. And it's now, I'll go back to Mr. Lima with the stick-it notes on the wall. We as a board have to make a decision on what we're gonna do with this property that we own. And I agree wholeheartedly with Supervisor Bennett. I'm totally against being in competition with our other residential businesses out there that I have a hard time competing against entities that are paying taxes. So, meaning, you know, weddings and such. So when you get into the barn, I would like a consent agreement or a motion made by somebody to secure that barn. Last month during Christmas vacation, I went out there, I was checking plowing areas and plowing that our DPW does. And I drove through that facility and I made it, I told everybody that, I brought it to Mr. Leman's attention, I believe, and to Supervisor Bennett's, that there was footprints going in and out of that area. You know, small youth, small boot size, going in and out of that barn, trying to get into it and screwing around. You have to remember that during the school year, that teachers take people, kids, and they excavate that area. So I know for a fact that if I went to school and I lived in that area, I'd be out there screwing around. But we have to secure that barn. Now, granted, after tonight's report from Superintendent Lemata saying that the barn isn't any danger of falling down right now, that puts my mind at ease, because I thought it was in imminent danger of collapsing any day.
Trustee, may I ask you a question? Do you think we can get an agreement tonight, a consensus tonight, to do two things? Get an estimate on the cost that it would take to restore the barn, and get an estimate on the cost it would take to raise the barn.
I know that there's a estimate in the Perry Homestead minutes to refurbish and fix the barn, and I believe it's like 128,000 and change. Does that number ring a bell, Dennis?
I can't remember.
So that was the number that.
Trustee, the only reason I'm thinking that way is simply because if we don't move on the bond now, it'll be next year before probably something.
Oh, I'm sure we can kick the can down like everyone else has for more years than that.
Yes.
So we could, we can look into getting some estimates probably on
Yes.
raising the barn.
But my point is we have to find out our purpose before we put any more money into into the homestead. We really do. We've got to come up with, that's why we were elected. We're the ones, we have to come up with what we want to do with the property, Trustee Massey.
I'm not disagreeing with you, Trustee.
Before we put any money into this thing, I'd like to, tonight, what I'd like to see happen is that barn gets secured, maybe some type of, I don't know, I was thinking of a snow fence all the way around it, but Supervisor Bennett reminded me, well, if you were a kid, you just climb over it anyways. So I don't know what to think.
Should be padlocked. Is it open? Is it padlocked now? Or can it be walked into at any time, or is it
Well-
locked, right?
I don't think it's padlocked. I think they have, because of the shape it's in, some of the doors and windows, whatever, I think that's been boarded up, and, I mean, there's boards and wood there holding it, but I
But
don't
maybe
think
we
it's
could
that
put
kind of
padlocks on, so at least people that need to get in there will have a key to get in, and other people won't be able to get in, because it could be a hazard, like Trustee Massey was saying. We don't want somebody in there when no one's around and something happened. I mean, they could fall and hurt themselves. The building's still fine, but we still get a problem because we get an open building.
Well, let's, I think on the Perry Homestead, one of the things, I guess we want to make sure it's secure, so I think, Mr. Lehman, if we can send somebody out there to, I don't know, our police chief's here, we haven't had any calls for any issues out there, but if we can make sure that it's secure, I think that'll put our board at ease. In terms of spending any money currently, you know, before we do anything else, Mr. Lemata, are we scheduled to spend any money like immediately on that facility, or what's the prognosis on our budget with spending?
You're not, if you recall, Supervisor Bennett, the board authorized separate line items for the Perry Homestead for 2018, which is a huge help as your budget manager. And thank you for that. There was $10,000 allocated in there. Out of that $10,000, we were allocated we pay the security alarm system, we pay the water bill, we pay the electric bill, any miscellaneous minor repairs. We've had some issues with some of the vent stacks, the rubber around the vent stacks, things like that we've repaired periodically from animal damage. And so that's really what that $10,000 was designed for. Also remember last year that the Historic District Commission came in and asked you about putting together that RFP for completing the kitchen project. Debbie Honay worked on it and did deliver me an RFP, but then it ended up including several items like fixing walls in the hallway that led to the upstairs, and so that's got to be revised and redone. So we haven't put that RFP out for bids on it. I think their estimate initially when they asked about it was going to be about $17,000. It came in closer to $30,000. I don't remember the exact amount with the other additional work in there.
I thought it was 82.
Started out at 8.
And so it grew from the presentation until the RFP that came in. Like I said, it has to be scaled back and revised and strictly focus on the kitchen, because I believe that was this board's intent, was to have them do an RFP on what it would cost to finish the kitchen. So I have to scale back that RFP before we send it out. It has been on the front burner for us because I thought it would be sometime during the winter that we would do it. We can pull that back completely right now until this board determines through the task force or as a board on how we're moving forward, but there is no money allocated towards it. What we did talk about is that you have two options that you could do to allocate money towards it. One would be out of capital projects fund to allocate a budget amendment to transfer from capital projects fund into the Perry fund now and do it. You also have the Parks and Recreation millage, which would you could transfer money out of that fund, and instead of putting it into Bicentennial Park, for example, it would be available for the Perry Homestead, because the way your language read in that it allows you to do the purchase of equipment, maintenance, or operations of your recreational assets within the township borders.
Mr. Mansour?
So we've spent a lot of time going through each one of these in Parks and Rec here and Perry Homestead, and I think if I'm not mistaken, we've kind of said we need to secure this barn. But I would ask if the board would kind of continue to move through this. We've got a plan to get ideas from board members on each of these areas, and so if we can just move forward with that, it just kind of expedite the meeting.
I think one of the things that, and some of these task forces are moving, quicker than others, but I think one of the things that Mr. Thomas wants to make sure of is that we don't commit any more funds in the meantime before we have that board retreat. So I would say to dial back the RFP until we have that meeting and see if we can secure the barn as well.
And that was the task force question, just not mine. It was the task force request to the board.
Well, and just one last comment is that, I mean, we're not out of the woods financially yet either as far as a township. I mean, Mr. Lehman has sent to our board what would you call it?
It's a report.
Discussion, a report with regard to, you know, the revenue sharing dollars from the state. And we need to make sure that the next few years aren't necessarily meaning that, you know, just because the economy is great, that we're going to be flush with state revenue dollars. And every decision we make to put money in one place takes it away from somewhere else. I guess I want to make sure if we're spending, I don't know, I don't want to call it recreational dollars, maybe it is with Perry House, but we ought to make sure that where we're putting that money gets the best bang for the buck. And I'm not sure, and we think we need to look at where that money would most be our residents would most benefit from the expenditure of our money. So with that, planning and zoning, Mr. Mansour and I are on that, and they have their master plan, so we'll be giving input there. The zip code, Miss Lane and I have met with Jet Kilmer. I've met with her numerous times over the past couple of years, and we have a letter on our website. People are filling those out, and we also budgeted a small amount of money for doing a mailing. So, Miss Lane?
And this past Monday, we mailed out roughly 260 letters with return envelopes to commercial industrial facilities within 48507, both the property owners and their tenants, and asked them to please consider signing those letters, returning them to us, and we established a deadline of March 31st.
Okay.
Ms. Lane?
Yes.
Thank you so very much for taking the time out of your busy weekend and stuffing every single one of those envelopes yourself. I appreciate it as a business owner.
You're very welcome. But my car was in Alceres, so.
No, I was trying to be nice.
All right, moving on to operational issues. The board will consider a motion to approve the recommendation from the election committee regarding compensation for election workers. Ms. Lane?
Well, the election commission is here, and I sent you a memo. Election workers for training are required to be recertified every year, and the $10 a day has been in existence since forever, at least we can guarantee 1987. And now with training being necessary with the new equipment and the new procedures that the county wants to institute, so we're all being consistent in our work, the commission was recommending $10 an hour for the election workers. And on the day of the election, which starts at 6 a.m. and can go as late as 10 and later, increasing the pay from $175 to $200 for co-chairs and $150 to $175 for election workers, knowing that they spend an inordinate amount of their day and night there. And they recommended the improvements, and roughly it was less than $10,000. But again, we had a training session today with the county, and they want more training for different areas of elections.
Just for clarification, what will be less than $10,000?
The total cost. Mr.
Okay.
Mr. Mansour asked me to sort of generate a concept of what the additional $25 per inspector would cost, and the $10 in training, which is on an average at least 3 hours. And so I did that, and it came in, I believe Mr. Mansour would have my memo back, but it was under $10,000 for the year.
For the total amount?
And for total, and I did.
Total
put in
incremental amount, yes.
Okay.
And I did have money put in my budget for the elections this year
So you have done a pro forma and it does fit within your current budget?
Well, I'm hoping. I received a phone call yesterday from the schools, and they're thinking of a special election in May. So we'll see what happens with that. They're going to be talking with the county, because I had to tell the county, and the county said they hadn't called them, so.
Okay. Mr. Massey?
Chair,
Yes.
The commission did meet, and at that time, I agreed with Clerk Lane, what she wanted. But I would ask this board to table this. I have not completed my survey that I'm doing to see what other townships and municipalities are paying, because I don't have any history on what they're paying. I only have what we are paying. I'd like to see where we are, how we stack up against others. And I would like to table this until I get more data and bring it back to the board and explain to the board what others are doing. Now, I have talked to one, and that's the city of Flint. I did speak to the clerk there, and the clerk is in the process of revamping their pay schedule. So I would like to see what others are doing along with us before I vote on this.
Ms. Lane?
We are already scheduling, have scheduled a mandated mock election for January 30th. And that is one of the reasons why I was asking for the $10 an hour when they start coming in. I know all the clerks are going to be doing that, and I think my request is reasonable, and we have one of the large, well, next to Flint, we are the largest as far as elections. So
Mr. Thomas?
I'd like to make a motion that the board approves the recommendation of the election committee regarding the compensation for election workers.
Mr.
Yes.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I totally disagree, and I cannot support that because I said I want more time to collect data, to bring it back to the board. Now, I did.
But the problem is
Listen,
that it's time sensitive, as there's an election on the 30th.
Let's have one at a
January.
time talk. Mr. Massey?
You interrupted me. Let me finish. I heard Clerk Lane say she wasn't sure that the raise would meet the budget, if I understood her correctly.
no, we'll be all right.
Well, you didn't say that. But I asked for time, okay? To delay this until the next meeting, if you have someone coming in and you decide whatever you want to pay them $10 an hour. So after I have completed my research, then you can make it retroactive.
No, I don't think that's something that we have not done in the past, is do things retroactive, Mr. Massey.
No, hold it.
Ask Mr.
Is
Lima.
that illegal? You're trying to project the image that is.
Okay, let's have one person at a time. Mr.
Ask
Massey?
Mr.
Ms. Lane? Let's have Mr.
Chairman
Massey.
Bennett, so we have, I think trustee Thomas made a motion. I think the next point is to have support for that or no support for that.
Or we can have discussion until then, but,
Okay,
But-
so if we're willing to have discussion before we
well.
have a
we can,
second.
but Is there a second, or?
I'll second it.
So let me offer something. There's two things wrapped up in this. There's training, which is $10 an hour, which is a one-time, kind of a one-time deal.
For everybody?
Yeah, for all the people that are coming in for the mock election on January, whenever you
30th.
said, 30th. And I think that was covered in the training budget that Clerk Lane put together because of the new voting machines. So, for me personally, that seems fine. The other portion of it amounts to somewhere around 16-17% increase to the election workers' pay, well, recognizing that it hasn't been changed since 2016. No, it's
It was
over
2009.
9. So it's been 6 or 7 years so it's over a period of time.
I was thinking it was 2016. Mr. Limita,
I
under the
have
previous
minutes.
clerk, didn't we make a change?
So what happened with the previous clerk in 2016 is that due to the length of time that the election workers were here for the election in November of 2016, she had sent in, she gave them $200, paid 6 election workers $200 instead of the $175. Otherwise, election workers received compensation of $150 to $175 per election worked, and the training was at a $10 flat fee back in 2016. But the clerk at the time authorized an increase in what they were reimbursed for. She submitted the payroll at a higher rate than had been approved by the election commission. I had the HR generalist research this for me today, and that was the answer I got back, that she had pushed through there was no meeting minutes to support a change, but the previous clerk had given them basically overtime because it ran into the wee hours of the morning.
So Chairman, I was just saying I could see splitting those and
Yes.
maybe doing the training and maybe we could get consensus on that and then providing time to do the research on the overall
Yeah.
compensation of election.
How would that fit, Mr. Massey? If we did $10 on the training wage, but yet we hold off on approving the increase, the overall increase, until you're able to do your research for
I
the...
agree to that.
Mr. Thomas, would you amend your motion to allow for that?
Or,
We would accommodate the
So,
clerk with her training coming up.
I
the end of this
understand
month.
that on the $10 an hour, and the clerk at the last election, so our previous clerk already paid workers $175 and $200, correct? So our election workers basically never change.
I don't know about that, but-
The turnover rate's like 2%, 3%, right? So they got paid $175 and $200 last election, am I right, Superintendent Limata?
That's correct.
So what we're asking for, what our clerk right now, this is just questions, our clerk right now is asking that we authorize the exact same thing that the election workers got paid last cycle, correct?
Correct, except for the training wage. Instead of a $10 training wage, it's $10 per hour training wage. That's the difference.
And it's the same. So all that our clerk right now is asking for is to match the same thing that the prior clerk paid at the last election, correct?
Although our last clerk didn't come to the board before doing it.
Okay, so what my point is that, so our clerk wants to pay them the same exact thing that they got paid last year, last cycle, except our clerk now is not going to pay overtime like the last one did. So I don't see how you can pay somebody less than they got paid the year before.
I knew
I don't think
nothing
anybody's
about what
advocating.
happened.
Yeah. Well, let's
that.
let's cut to the chase here. I think. you
What are
know,
we trying to do,
the-
save a dollar?
I think we want to do things in an orderly fashion. And I think that what Mr. Massey's asking for, he isn't suggesting that we cut pay or anything else. Simply look at what other people are paying. What Mr. Mansour has asked is that we have a training coming up the end of this month that we pay the $10 per hour to them. And we take some time to look at, maybe we want to pay more, and maybe we do want to put something in the motion to cover overtime. I didn't hear anybody say we're not going to pay overtime. Maybe that's a consideration if the election goes past a certain number of hours, maybe there is a provision for that, I don't know. But I think there's nothing wrong with taking a thoughtful approach to looking at this. I think it may end up that maybe we aren't paying enough, or maybe we need to have some provision if there's a recount or take into account other extenuating circumstances. So, we're covering what Ms. Lane needs, which is training later this month, if we agreed that we're gonna go with the $10 training, or the $10 per hour for training, and then we have some time yet. We don't have any election coming up. Also, just as a point, I don't know if anybody's read the MTA's township update, but there is some consideration for legislation that would not allow for special millage questions on the May election. So how soon they would pass that, and how soon anybody's going to be asking for a millage, may change.
February 13th is the deadline for a May special election.
Right, which the law is right now.
I'd like
being
to
considered.
amend my motion for the $10 an hour pay.
Support?
Okay, any further discussion? And then, Mr. Massey, you'll do your research with Ms. Lane, and
Yes,
I take it you probably bring to the election commission, and then the
Yes.
commission will report back to the board.
yes.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. As you can see, we're trying to come to consensus on these before we have a motion, so I appreciate, I guess, one of the things, if we can make our motion so that we incorporate everybody's concerns is the goal. The next item is the board will consider a motion to accept for second reading and adoption an amendment to the criminal code ordinance number 08-03, section 3, to address a change in state law regarding a minor in possession penalty. This is our second reading, Mr. Lehman, or
Yes.
Mr. Leidy?
That's correct. We were going to schedule a second reading at our next subsequent meeting, and it missed it, and so this is just follow-up. And again, this is just the adjusting our local ordinance to reflect the changes made at the state level for minors in possession.
So moved.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, is there a second?
I think Mr. Mayor.
Second.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
all right.
Mr. Superintendent, to Chief Wiles, it's going to be published on Thursday with immediate effect, Chief.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Item C, the board will consider a motion to approve the request of the Director of Assessing for an adjustment of the guidelines for tax abatement status. The request is to increase the maximum time for real property tax abatement based upon the amount of capital investment from the current 6 years to 8 years to recognize those companies that choose to build replacement facilities in the township, thereby retaining jobs that would have gone elsewhere. Mr. Limita?
The reason this is before you is really, and it came up with some economic development activity that we're currently working on with someone who already exists in the community but has looked at moving outside the country or outside of Genesee County and certainly Grand Blanc Township. And so we're in a competition, and one of the things that came up, they're working with the state of Michigan Economic Development Corp through the Flint Genesee Chamber, and then obviously back through us. When you look at the guidelines that we currently have for the industrial facilities tax, they can get so many years of that IFT tax abatement by certain things. Number one is type of use, whether it's R&D, high technology, those are good for 4 years max. Manufacturing 2, assembly or warehousing is worth 1 year. Then it's the amount that was invested in real property and the capital investment. If it's new, it's worth so many. If it's a rehab, and then it's by a dollar amount where it maxes out at $6 million. So once you hit $6 million, it maxes out. And then the third area would be the potential average increase in employees earning 3 times the national minimum wage rate or more. And 5 to 25 employees, you get a year. 26 to 50 employees, you get 2. What we discovered is that this has worked very well for us until we have the opportunity to retain some jobs here. We have an employer who has 600 jobs. And if we keep them here, they're willing to make a $24 million investment in a new facility. Unfortunately, we can only offer them 10 years abatement instead of the 12 because we have some exclusions, the maximum time for real property tax abatement, except for those with starred lines, and that was more than $6 million or with more than 500 employees, would only be at 6 years instead of 8. We're asking you to change that to 8 years because what we realized is that we don't have the ability to award the additional time for retaining those jobs here. We can only get them 10 years. We think we'd be much more competitive in this process if we make that change to an 8-year abatement period, maximum time between type of use and capital investment. We don't have any way to, even though they're not bringing in new jobs, we certainly don't want the vacuum of 600 jobs leaving out of Grand Blanc Township. And this minor change would allow us to offer them the 12 years of abatement. Now again, all this does is change our guidelines. Each individual who comes for you and asks for the tax abatement is going to have to fill out an application, provide the materials, and then come before you to ask the board to offer them. You have the ability then to look at each individual and determine up to 12 years maximum how long you'll offer that tax abatement for. So this doesn't automatically guarantee anybody anything. It just expands our options when we're trying to work from an economic development standpoint of retaining jobs within our community.
Mr. Massey?
I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for the superintendent. In the process of you collaborating with these companies, I'm using the plural sense, these companies, do you get a feel at that point how long you think they would remain in the township? You know, sometimes you can feel that, okay, this company wants this abatement, but they're probably looking at saving money to relocate elsewhere. Else, this company is sincere about remaining in the township.
Absolutely, Trustee Massey, is like in the incidents that, like the specifics that we're talking about now, you're talking about a $24 million investment with a company who has made it known, although we can't release their name in a non-disclosure agreement with all the principals that are working with them. But they have, they're willing to put in a $24 million investment into your community. That tells me that they're probably not looking to go anywhere in the near future. And again, that $24 million, so what happens with the tax abatement? We only get 50% of what we would have collected if we didn't offer the abatement. However, if we don't offer the abatement, I think that there will be another community announcing a $24 million expansion of their community versus us. And so it's tough when you look at that retaining jobs versus creating jobs. But I think when somebody offers to make a $24 million investment, I would say they're pretty serious about remaining it within your community for the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
Mr. Kuzak?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to approve this motion.
So moving.
Okay. And I think, you know, it's one thing that they're building, well, it'd be one concern if they weren't building a new facility and just asking for the abatement, but
Yes.
that's such a considerable investment. I mean, I'm sure that, I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas?
Nothing, I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm sure there's other communities that would love to have a $24 million investment. So there's been a motion, it's been seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. And item 7, what are you hearing from the community? I think we've heard and we've discussed quite a bit about what we're hearing in the community. Anything else, Mr. Thomas? Go ahead. You've had somebody bring something to you, Mr. Thomas? Or do you want to report it in your task force? We can bring it to the task force.
Okay.
Okay. It's an issue with regard to our agreement with Parks and Rec that I think probably we'll let the task force handle it. Anybody else hearing anything in the community that?
Yes, the last weather that came about, freezing the streets,
Yes.
it appeared to me, it's quite apparent to me that the road commissioner really didn't do a good job. And I know the answer that the road commissioner has. When the temperature reaches a certain degree, Fahrenheit, it's hard for salt to melt the ice. But in this instant, I understand that, but it was sort of going up during the day, and there were certain intersections that I thought they should have dedicated more time to than actually trying to dedicate a lot of time to the entire road. That's my personal opinion, and I've seen this happen many, many times in Genesee County. We don't have that much of bad weather like we had this past weekend.
Yeah, judging by the amount of concern on social media, on our, township social media, I would say that vast majority of people had a concern with the conditions of the major roads. I think one thing that our DPW director found was that Genesee County Road Commission actually, they put less salt per mile than the other road commissions. The other issue was that they pre-wet the salt in other counties, and for whatever reason, they can't pre-wet the salt because the equipment won't work on the trucks in Genesee County if they pre-wet it. Evidently, somehow pre-wetting that salt when it goes into the truck, when it's applied to the icy roads, starts working much quicker or is more effective, and they're unable to do that in Genesee County. But I know that it's definitely being brought to the road commission, and the road commission did appoint a new road commissioner. They appointed, I got a mental block right now.
Shirley Cotton-Jones?
Shirley Cotton-Jones, who was the prior supervisor for Atlas Township. And I think she'll be a great addition to the road commission. She has firsthand knowledge of residents' concerns and complaints, and I think one of the things that they're working on is addressing how they respond to resident complaints. One of the things that I think we should urge our residents to do is that when they have an issue, to complain to the road commission, because the road commission actually on a monthly basis reports what there's several garages. There's probably 8 garages around the county. The road commission garage that we work out of is in Atlas Township. And anyways, they track what those complaint numbers look like. And Swartz Creek garage actually gets more complaints than ours in Atlas Township. They also include Flint Township in that Swartz Creek garage, but I would encourage people to fill out the form that's on the website or call the number if they have a complaint with regard to roads. I think because I shouldn't surmise this, but I think people feel they can come to our township with all types of issues, but I think we need to make sure we're directing them to the right agency, and that would be Genesee County Road Commission. I mean, we like to go to bat for people, but sometimes it's better if they hear it directly from our residents that there's an issue. So.
I think they did an outstanding job on the roads on Monday.
On Monday?
Yeah, this morning I went out through.
Oh, this Monday, you mean? Okay, all right. Mr. Mansour?
I was going to skip ahead in the agenda
Yes,
And
future
make a-
agenda items.
and make a motion to adjourn.
Support.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay.